This is a review of a Ronin Katana European model number 7 two-handed longsword bastard sword, some sort of big sword. This is going to be the destruction test on this particular sword. If you would like to see a review with my thoughts and other types of shenanigans, please click here to see that video first. A couple quick notes before we get going. First up, this sword was sent to me from Ronin Katana for the purposes of destruction. That is the destiny of this sword and what this test is intended to do. It's going to break it. And I know that pisses some of you off to see me intentionally abuse a perfectly good sword. Well, for those of you that don't like seeing it, I don't have a lot of good news for you. This is going to be a lot of wrecking stuff. However, hopefully it gives buyers an idea of what the sword can do before it takes any kind of damages, and it prevents people from doing silly things to their swords themselves. So maybe I'm saving the lives of a few swords out there, but probably not. Second, I'm not very good at martial arts. I'm not in HEMA, Historic European Martial Arts. I do mostly Japanese and Filipino martial arts, and I'm not even good at those. Keep in mind that I don't really know what I'm doing, and if I look like an asshat, it's because I am. Keep that in mind as you see me moving the blade around. It's probably not the blade, it's probably me. An additional note is someone else broke this first. I wasn't the first person to test it, and I'm probably going to be the last because it's broken now. But keep in mind it was used prior to me and may not be representative of a brand new one from Ronin Katana. Lastly, don't listen to me. This sword was sent to me from Ronin Katana gratis. I didn't have to pay for it. You might think that could skew my observations, and you're probably completely right about that. I do like Ronin Katana products, but I'm not an employee. I'm not a fanboy. I try to stay objective, but you don't really have to take my word for it. I try to do my best to keep these types of tests as honest and transparent as possible. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope that the video really speaks for itself. Here are some specifications of the sword. It's got a 36.5 inch blade and a 10.5 inch handle. The center of percussion is 22 inches from the guard approximately, and the point of balance is about 3 inches from the guard. If you have more questions about this particular stuff, please pause it so you can see the things with the things. Keep in mind that the testing for this video is done in chronological order rather than logical order, so I jump around from medium to medium in terms of cutting. Also, this cutting has come after the review cutting that I did in the previous and aforementioned review video, which I'm not linking now because I don't want to. From the standpoint of cutting, this is rolled wet newspaper. Most of it has a wooden core inside of it. They vary in diameter from about 4 inches to a little over 6 inches in diameter. The newspaper has been wetted for several days and then dried out for a few days. It gives it a very dense, hard to cut type feel. I don't know exactly how you would describe it, but it is not a particularly fun medium to cut. In terms of penetration, you can see here that the sword, when I thrust it into the newspaper, probably went in about 3.5 inches. Cutting into the rolled wet newspaper, you can see that I'm having a hell of a time trying to get through it. After this cut, you see a somewhat rare glimpse of me trying to take photos and squish. Back to the fun. This is what rolled wet newspaper looks like. You can see it's relatively dense, but not so dense that I can't move it lightly with my hands if I squeeze real hard. I did a few cuts on rolled Wet Tatami, and the sword cut through it very simply. It was a joy to cut, and this is a more traditional cutting medium, and you can see how much easier it is in comparison to some of these rolled wet newspapers when I switch back to them, which it does not cut through. Now I'm going to start cutting logs, and you would consider this the start of where abuse really begins in this testing. Some of the logs are out of a fire pit that is next to me because it's cold outside when I'm testing, and so I'll make a fire to keep me nice and toasty. It also serves to harden up the wood and make it somewhat difficult to cut, obviously. I'm using the sword like an axe, and my intention is to try and bend it with the wood, to try and move it around, see if the blade flexes in a way that it doesn't return from, or maybe just to dull the edge significantly or chip it. After cutting the logs and starting the abusive portion of testing, I am unable to perceive any significant damage with the edge. I do a quick sharpness test with the same side of the edge that I was using on the logs, and the sword is somewhat sharp. I wouldn't necessarily obviously call it great paper cutting sharp, but it's moving through the paper easily enough after smacking it on logs, which is a positive sign. Again, this sword was used, so it's hard for me to say where the edge should be, but it's sharp enough to do basic paper cutting. This will be the first round of bending, and I'm sorry I don't have a backdrop for you to see the angles. Hopefully you can use the trees as a point of reference to see the angle or steepness of the bend. Keep in mind that this is after the sword has been tested by another party, as well as undergoing some basic abusive testing. So if there were any flaws in the sword, they're more likely to come out now and be exacerbated by the bending than they would be if I were to start with the bending. After doing a little bending, I am unable to see any type of significant bend or deformation in the alignment of the sword. It seems overall in good order, even though I keep smacking it on the stand. Now I'm doing a little bit of torture testing on the tip. Forgive the length of this particular part of the video, but I wanted you to be able to see all of the smacks that the tip endured while it stayed in good shape. So I'm using a treated piece of lumber, and basically I'm just straight up going to town, smashing the tip into this piece of lumber repeatedly, as well as twisting it back and forth to try and aggravate the blade or make it chip off. Hopefully the tip would just break off, but no such luck. It actually made it through this round of tip banging into lumber reasonably well without any deformation. I took the tip and smacked it into sheet metal on top of that lumber, and the very first gouge into the sheet metal, and I was able to roll the tip over. It didn't quite break off, but it did roll over in such a way that it is noticeable. This damage was not there before just smacking it into the wood. Now I'm going to try and cut into some sheet metal. This is a microwave back plate that I had around for some reason. It makes me think I have some sort of microwave just lingering around my house without a plate on the wall. But it serves as a good source of sheet metal to smack the sword into. You can see that I'm actually able to cut relatively deeply with each stroke into the sheet metal. Obviously it is metal, it's not easy to cut, but I'm actually surprised at the level of penetration that the sword gets into the metal. This video shows the condition of the sword after all of the testing that you have seen so far. So some sheet metal smacking into logs, bending back and forth, and all sorts of other shenanigans. Overall, the sword is held up reasonably well. There's edge damage, but none of it seems to go any deeper than a couple millimeters. And the cord wrap that I was initially thinking would loosen up in destructive testing is actually held on pretty well. The pommel's very tight. There's a small rattle in the guard, but the little thread-like stuff or the wrapping on the guard is held up really well, despite me having big sausage hands that would loosen it up pretty quick. It should also be noted that the damage so far seems as though it could be repaired. I don't have the skill to do it myself, but if you are handy with a belt grinder or a sharpener of some sort, most of this appears that it would take you some time to fix, but it could be done. This video is the worst of the damage, something that's hard to see with the naked eye and what I thought initially was a crack, but it appears to just be a very deep scratch. This video is from a digital microscope. Hopefully it helps you see the damage a little bit better. The next bit of shenanigans is a little bit of sword-on-sword contact. This is a Glamgring 440 SLO kind of wall hanger sword that I'm using just for some edge-on-edge contact testing. You can see that the Ronin is a superior built sword as the crossguard kind of went flying off the other one. This is again a microscope bit of footage so you can see the difference in edge deformation from the edge-on-edge contact. The 440 S-blade versus the damage to the Ronin Katana European model number 12. I'm going to do a little bit more sword bending. Now you might ask why, and that's because this sword has gone through a lot more testing now. If any of the testing caused significant cracks that I'm not able to see or show you, well, this would likely expose them directly because it would cause the sword to break in half or at least make it much more likely than when I bent it the first time. Now, what I'm able to see is not a lot. The sword does take a slight set, and this is something that it didn't do the first time that I bent it. I noticed that each time I bend it back and forth, it takes a set, but very, very small based on the angle that you can see me bending the sword at. When I stop to check for bends, I do notice that there are slight bends in the blade, but very minor overall, considering what you just saw. The next thing I do is I strike the blade against the side of a tree against the flat of the blade several times. I'm giving it a little bit of gusto here, and hopefully it causes the blade to deform in some significant way. But that really wasn't the case. That's what I was going for, but no matter how hard I smacked the blade, it really didn't deform at all. Now it's time to try something perhaps a little more drastic, since smacking the sword against a tree really isn't doing it. So I'm taking a giant concrete cinder block and throwing it at the sword. You can see the results here. The sword I missed the first time, so it didn't really do too much damage. I've also assembled this bit of rock around it to keep the sword chunks from flying back at me in the event the sword shatters. Finally, as I clear away some rubble, you're able to see that the sword has indeed taken a relatively significant set, and the sword is damaged in such a way that it is difficult to use. It still kind of works as a sword, but not really so much. I do my best to straighten it out against a tree by whacking it repeatedly, and the sword does straighten out a little bit, indicating that the metal's been fatigued since it's kind of taking a set much easier, able to be manipulated and straightened much easier than it was before. So I'm setting the test up again, and I'm going to chuck a rock at it some more. At this point, the sword has taken quite a bit of a bend and needs to be straightened out, which I will attempt to do, but it has not broken yet and is still semi-functional as a sword. I'm setting the rock test up one more time so the sword is at an angle. Hopefully I can catch the edge of the sword with the rock. Keep in mind this rock is heavy and hard to throw. And I can actually say I hit the edge reasonably well. The sword did not take as much of a set or a bend as I would have thought it would, but then again this is on the strong side of the sword where it's not intended to really flex, so kudos I guess. At this point, the sword has all but beaten me. The tip did roll and break off a little bit, but other than that, there's no abrasion on the sword that's really much more than a couple millimeters, and it took a lot of energy, like throwing a big 50-pound rock at it, in order to give it a significant bend. I'm going to smack the sword against a rock in the attempt to maybe chip an edge or cause it to roll or deform again in some way, but realistically, this is the last bit of testing I'm going to do. At this point, I'm really throwing in the towel. I've put the sword through a whole bunch of different, pretty abusive scenarios, and the sword is still in one piece and arguably functional as a sword to this point. Though I would say the metal is fatigued and it's probably not what it once was, still, it's working. I'd like to throw in a quick note about handling. I'm not a HEMA practitioner, as I mentioned before, so I really don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with this thing. However, I can say that as a sword, it seems pretty easy to control for its size. It's not a small blade and it's not a light blade by comparison to many others. However, I found that the tip is easy to control and the maneuverability of the blade is actually relatively comfortable. It grows on you a little bit more than it has any right to as well. The more you handle it, the more comfortable it feels in your hand and the more agile and more appealing it feels, especially when you start to compare it to other swords. I bought a Windlass sword of Roven just because it was a museum replica's deal of the day, but also because it's in a similar price category to this sword, so I decided I would compare them. And that's really where the Ronin started to sink. The Windlass arguably has some aesthetic characteristics that I find more appealing. A fuller, a brighter blade, a different style of handle grip, but the Ronin frankly cut better. It was easier to control and it felt less dead in my hand. So when I compare them to what other blades are available in the same price category, that's when a really idea of value starts coming into my head and where I start to appreciate this sword more than I would otherwise. Now is the part of the video where I should answer the question, is it worth it or not? And that's not really tough to do in this case, but before I do, I want to answer a couple quick points, or rather address a couple quick points. So if you watched the video before, the review that I did, then you'll know there were a couple things that I was a little concerned about going into this test. And first off was the center of percussion. It's a little low on this blade, and I thought by striking here and the center of percussion being lower that I would feel a lot of residual nonsense in my hands, or that I'd feel a lot of feedback or vibration, and I really didn't. Cutting was not problematic at all. I didn't get a lot of vibration in my hands, even when I was whacking the sword into rocks and what have you. Not any more than I do any other sword when I whack it into rocks. So that wasn't really a big concern, or didn't prove to be anything problematic, more so than you would expect, or more so than is usual. The other thing was this wrap. I was a little concerned that this cord wrap, I've had a couple swords that I've tested before and it's come undone, and that didn't happen in this iteration. The handle has a little bit, I can twist it or move it around ever so slightly, but it's still on there pretty tight. I didn't have a problem losing edge alignment, and it hasn't come undone. And as you plainly saw, I was not very kind to it. So the fact that it's held up gives me a little bit more confidence in this cord wrap than I had before, and kudos to that. The next part is the pommel. It's still on there rock solid. It doesn't move around at all, but the guard did get a little bit more rattly than it was before. This had a little wiggle before I started, but honestly, I threw rocks at it, for Pete's sake, and it has not really had any more problems. It's not much wigglier than it is before, and it's still reasonably functional. And when I compare this to other swords, you saw me compare it to a windlass sword of Roven, there's a couple other points that I should note about it. One, this does not have a big pronounced secondary bevel, and that probably assisted quite a bit. The overall feeling is a lot easier to move around when I compare it to other swords in the same category. Aesthetically, it looks very plain, but the overall blade is just fun to move around. And if you look along the planes, well, this one is not a great example anymore because it's beat to crap, but the planes by comparison to the windlass swords were relatively smooth. The windlass kind of rippled all around in the light, and this one did so less, and that makes me think that it's got a little bit more attention done to the overall geometry of the blade. It's very flexible, but that didn't prove problematic. I was able to do some pretty reasonable penetrations in the wood that I was stabbing, as well as the rolled newspaper targets, and overall I'm just very pleased with the performance of the sword, how maneuverable it was, and how comfortable it was to manipulate. So when you ask me, is it worth it? More so now than when I had done the previous review. After doing some testing, yeah, I can see that this sword really took a beating, and the fact that it's still in a sword shape-esque, it's certainly not what it was when we started, but the fact that it's still functional as a sword is very impressive to me. And I would say that, in sub $300, compared to the other pieces that are out there, if you're looking for something that's fun to do cutting with, something that's easy to manipulate, and that isn't just kind of a showpiece, then I'd say that this has a lot of value for you, more so than maybe some of the other things that are out there that are more dedicated aesthetically than this one is. And I was just able to beat the crap out of it, and it lived, and I'm always tickled by that. So yeah, it gets my thumbs up. And if you found this interesting, I hope you did, or at least found it mildly useful to make a decision about what sword you might want to buy. If you did, throw me a thumbs up. If you like this kind of nonsense, click subscribe, throw any commentary you have below. And as always, cheers, and thanks for watching.